So just a brief introduction. I'm a ventilation and animal welfare analyst at Galebreaker, and over the last year I've had a real keen interest in looking at the calf health and welfare and the effect that the environment and ventilation plays on that.
Yeah, I'm Gearon. I'm a design engineer at Galebreaker. I've been here for 6.5 years and I oversee the ventilation products that we provide. I've also taken on the training with Wisconsin University to design our vent tubes, PPTV.
So over the course of this presentation, we'll look at the importance of ventilation on calf welfare and performance, the hidden costs behind poor ventilation, practical tips to assess and improve your buildings, a return on investment for investing a system into your buildings, and taking our acronym AIM, assess, improve and maintain back to your farm buildings. So why should we focus on the environment that we place our calves in? Well, it's all about giving calves the best start. If you give calves the best start, you're looking at improved performance and improved herd longevity, and that ties into sustainability. A healthier animal is a more productive animal and therefore a more sustainable animal. And the environment that we place our calves in plays a key role in this. So when you think of poor ventilation, you think of poor respiratory disease, and this follows on really nicely from your presentation. Looking at bovine respiratory disease, it's one of the most significant diseases in calf in rearing young stock. And when you look at managing it, it comes down to a multifactorial triangle. So you've got your calves, that's where your immunity comes in, your colostrum management. You've got your pathogen, what pathogens are you up against? And then finally, you've got your environment. And where does ventilation come in? Well, ventilation's key in optimizing that environment. And you can break that environment up into 5 key points. So you've got moisture, temperature, fresh air, air speeds and drafts, and then hygiene. And we'll touch back on these 5 points later on. So the importance of ventilation on calf welfare and performance. Firstly, poor ventilation is a welfare issue and calf welfare should be standard practice on farms. Secondly, poor ventilation builds up dust and gas that will irritate the mucous membrane in the respiratory tract, and that can make your calves more susceptible to microorganisms and more susceptible to diseases. Good ventilation system will remove stale, damp air. Stale, damp air provokes a high moisture in the environment. Pathogens thrive in a high moisture environment, so a good ventilation system will help remove that stale, damp air. And a good ventilation in your building will reduce pneumonia outbreaks and promote the growth of healthy calves. And this quote really highlights the importance of having good ventilation in your building. If a virus is coughed up out in a building, it can remain there for 20 hours, in fresh air, 20 minutes. So the hidden costs behind poor ventilation. And what do we mean by hidden costs? Well, it's not what's happening to your calves there and then. It's what's happening 6 months down the line, 2 years down the line. What's that effect on that one case of pneumonia outbreak? So it's those costs that aren't visible. Bovine respiratory disease is a major impact of poor performance and will have long-term impacts and long-term lung damage on that calf. And there's a higher chance of that calf being removed from the herd or not making it to a good finishing weight. When you think of your immediate cost, that's when you think of that treatment's costing you there and then, that management, but that's not what we should be focusing on. It's those understanding that long-term impacts. Where's that long-term cost? And finally, it's important to remember that calves have really small lungs compared to other animals their size, and so any impact on their respiratory tract will affect their performance in the long term. And many cases go unnoticed. So these costs really highlight that impact of not just focusing on your immediate costs. But if you look at a dairy heifer here, that's costing, you could have a potential lifetime cost of £722. And that's because that one case of pneumonia will increase, that calf will die or be removed from the herd before first calving. If she makes it into the herd, she'll have reduced milk yield and reduced daily live weight gain. And it's the same for your beef calves. You're looking at longer time on farms and longer to get to that growth rate.
So now we come on to some of the common issues that we find with calf buildings and calf ventilation. So quite often calves are not placed into a bespoke building. Space is a premium on a farm, so quite often we use repurposed buildings. Now this is not necessarily ideal, but unfortunately it's part and parcel of what happens on a farm. With that, quite often calves are often placed in buildings with older stock. Now this is again not ideal. Contamination of dirty air with pathogens passing across calves with very low immunity is not ideal. It doesn't set them off on the right foot to start with. Their lower immunity means they're more susceptible to pick up diseases. They're often exposed to temperature fluctuations. Now, of course, because their critical temperature is higher when they're newly born, this is not ideal. So drafts within a building can have a great impact again on that, the chance of that calf being exposed or picking up any diseases. Now, within a lot of buildings, we need an ideal ventilation rate. We need that building volume to be changed a certain number of times per hour to put in fresh air. And sometimes with a lot of buildings, this is not possible. Again, you require the fresh air to go in, but you need that fresh air to go into the building at the right airspeed, not to create the drafts on the calves and not to have, again, a detrimental impact on their health. Now, whilst wind is free and whilst natural ventilation seems like a really good way to go, it lacks the control that the calves require. The calves require consistent controlled airflow, but natural ventilation doesn't really offer this. Now, with older stock in a building, you have the stack effect. So where you would have lower ventilation or there's less wind that day, the stack effect can help move that air out of the building. Now, unfortunately for calves, because they don't have the stack effect, this is much more difficult to achieve. Again, it means that the ventilation in that building is not ideal. So what's our basic requirements? So our basic requirements really is we want to improve that aerial hygiene within the building. We want fresh, clean air to be in that building for those calves to breathe in. We need it to be controlled and consistent. So they require this 24/7, regardless of what the weather is outside, and it needs to be delivered to them in a way in which isn't detrimental to them. We need to remove the moisture from the building. So as Chloe said, pathogens thrive in an environment with high moisture and can be passed around quite easily. And again, we need to look to remove this moisture. And then in the summer, calves are also susceptible to heat stress. So we need to look at removing some of the heat and the humidity from the building. Again, we don't want to be placing extra stress on those young calves. So our acronym of AIM, the first thing you need to do when you go back to your farm is to look at what your building design is like. So we're going to run through a few examples of things that you might see in some of your buildings. So in these two photographs here, what you can see is a lot of cobwebs and dust buildup. Really, this is a sign that your ventilation is not quite sufficient. So cobwebs are very present when there's not enough wind blowing through. Spiders love a still environment. And so what you've got here is you've got a building whereby the sides and the far side are brickwork and on the opposite side is corrugated steel. So you don't have that airflow coming into the building and you also don't have an exhaust at the top to allow that dirty air to escape. So essentially there is very, very little air movement throughout that building. Again, on the far side, you've got a similar thing. Again, no exhaust for that dirty air to escape. A lot of cobweb build-up on the underside of the roof space. In the middle, you've got some openings down the middle, but what you also have there is you have a large opening at the end. Again, this is not ideal. You're going to have wind coming through there, which will be much higher than what the calves require. You'll also have the rain coming in as well, which again hampers the environment for the calves. And on the far side of it, you've got some boarding. Now, again, this is not ideal. It's not a uniform inlet. What would be better here would be to have some sort of mesh-type fabric that would be able to block off the elements coming in. And again, here, what you see is quite dark buildings, not a lot of natural light. The brickwork's quite dirty, again, suggesting that there is a lack of suitable ventilation. There's no real inlets or outlets whatsoever there. So all your calves are doing is breathing in that dirty air that is just going to damage their lungs over and over, increasing your chances of having BRD, for example. So when you walk into your building, you're not just looking at the building itself. You can walk in and you can see what is going on with the animals, but also it's what you can smell. So on the picture on the far side, you've got a damp floor. And here, what you're going to end up with is a lot of moisture and an ideal environment, again, for all those pathogens to breed. What we also have here is, which is not ideal, is over the other side, the blue wall, is older stock. So what's happening is that dirty air is coming across from that older stock and then is going into the airspace of the young calves. On the far side, they've got fans to draw out that air, but all it's doing is pulling that dirty air across from the older stock into where the calves are. And again, that's not helping. This building does have an outlet down the middle, as you can see, which is a good thing. But what it's also got is ceiling fans. Now, ceiling fans are okay in this instance if the weather is 35 to 40 degrees. Calves can tolerate 1.3 metres per second, higher airflow during the summer to keep them cool, to limit heat stress. But for all year round ventilation, it's not really ideal. You can't control it in the way in which you need to, so it's not really ideal in this situation. If you were to turn those fans on and find you had a draft there, those calves would lie against the side walls, all gather up together, and they would be in a draft. It wouldn't be ideal. The photograph near to me, the calves are in deep straw, which is really good. One way to ensure that you've got enough straw to check you've got enough straw is to do a dry knee test. So you would simply kneel down in the straw, and if your knees are wet after a short period of time, the moisture is able to come through. You need to add more straw to that. The deep straws gives them an opportunity to keep that moisture away from the calves, but it also allows them to bed down and keep warm. But what also happened in this instance, and a good thing to do, is look at the behaviour of your calves. Your calves will tell you if you have any issues. In this instance, what we found was that the customer didn't really have many issues of BRD. But what they found was that their calves were lying next to this wall. And the reason was that just above the concrete wall, some of the Yorkshire boarding had been removed to become space boarding for the summer. So the air was flowing through quite nicely. The problem was that during the winter, this airspeed was too high. So the calves were lying next to the wall to get out of the way of that draft. So in this instance, you could put a horizontal board across the top of the wall on some hinges, which would then create its own microenvironment underneath. And then during the summer, you could fold that down and then use the barn as it is. So the way in which you can analyse and assess what your building ventilation is like is to perform a smoke test. Now, you can walk into a building and you might feel some drafts, you might not know where it's coming from. The best way to analyse it is to perform a smoke test. So in this instance, we stuck a bucket in the middle of the passageway with some smoke pellets. We watched where the air went, and as you can see in the middle, it rose up to the roof space, and then it went down the length of the building. So what you want here is this smoke to go up towards an opening in the middle of the building and dissipate out quite quickly. If the smoke takes a long time to dissipate out through the environment, out through the opening, it means your ventilation is insufficient. If it goes out too quickly, it means you've got too much air going through that building. If it goes from one side of the building to the other, it means you've got a cross-contamination, which again is not ideal. So in this instance, they had Yorkshire boarding down the side, which is okay on prevailing wind side, but it meant that some of the smoke went out, but the opening at the top was insufficient for what they needed.
So on to the improved aspect of our aim. So we're going to touch back on those 5 points that we mentioned at the beginning. Moisture. The target is to have dry calf housing. Increased moisture will make the environment damp. That means not only is your pathogens going to thrive in that, that's a colder environment for your calves. So look at your drainage. Make sure your drainage is right. And if you know that you've got poor drainage in your building, look at ways you can manage that. Can you add extra bedding at different times of year? Temperature. Calves are really sensitive to temperature fluctuations, and that warm temperature is really important in that first 4 months. If you know your building's cold, can you, like Scott said, make a microclimate for your calves, look at calf jackets, and even heat lamps, even though you will have that electrical cost. Fresh air. Having that fresh air consistently through your building is really important. And we measure that by looking at air exchanges, and that will change from the summer to the winter. So in the winter, you're looking at about 6 to 8 air exchanges per hour, but in the summer, you want to increase that up to 40 to 60. So that's looking at having a controlled ventilation system in the winter, and then in the summer, can you open your buildings up, letting more airflow in? And that's, like Scott said, the importance your outlet, that dirty, stale air has got to escape from your building somewhere. Air speeds and drafts, this is really where that importance comes in between a draft, having fresh air, and a draft. In the winter, you're looking at 0.2 metres per second at calf height. Anything over 0.3 is classed as a draft, and anything below 0.12 is still air. So it's a really fine line between getting that correct airspeed. In the summer, that can increase up to 1.3. And an easy way to measure that is an anemometer, and those you can buy quite cheaply online, and that will just tell you what your airspeed is in your buildings. And lastly, hygiene. Hygiene is vital. Your cars will thrive in a clean environment. Look at ways can you rest your pens, clean bedding and clean water.
So the best way really to control the environment in your building is to look at positive pressure tube ventilation, or PPTV. The reason being for this, as I described, is that natural ventilation is inconsistent, it's not controlled, it doesn't really offer you exactly what the calves need. Fans as well are it's difficult to control exactly what you want from those. So the best way to look at doing it is to go down tube ventilation route. Now this was looked at really back in the 70s to start with. We had some early tubes in the 80s. But this was taken on by Ken Nordland and co at Wisconsin University, where they looked at really the science and being able to produce PPTV in a way in which it didn't have a detrimental impact to the calf's health. And so what you're looking at doing is putting this fresh air into the building. So you would mount a fan at one end of the building, ideally away from slurry pits or anywhere where you're going to get contaminated air. The air is forced along the tube, and it comes out of the holes, which are angled and directed towards where the calves are. But the hole size is very, very important to make sure that you're getting the airspeed correct. So this is an example of a smoke test performed once a tube was in place. What we have in this scenario is at the end we have some mesh which blocks off any of strong winds coming in. There is a bit of an opening at the top, but in this building it's not as critical because we have automated side curtains. So what you can do with the side curtains is you can leave a small gap at the top, and that can allow the dirty air to escape. What you want is the fresh air to come down towards the calves and then rise up and take the dirty air away out of the building. But the key thing to watch with this as it gets near the video is the speed of the air when it gets close towards the calves. So the calves are quite inquisitive to what the smoke was to start with, but as you notice, as it gets closer towards the calves, it's very, very slow, which is ideal. It's not causing them any distress, it's not causing a draft, it's not hampering their health in any way.
So here we try to do a bit of a return on investment for investing in positive pressure tube ventilation. So we've taken a focus on the dairy side, looking at dairy heifers, and we've taken 100 calves going through your building in 1 year with a 20% pneumonia rate. And this would be looking at a building which your ventilation is one of the key points to your pneumonia outbreaks. And the University of Wisconsin, who created the positive pressure tube ventilation, comment that if it is a ventilation issue, that it can reduce pneumonia outbreaks by 25 to 75%. In this example, we've gone for 40%. So your immediate costs, and these are taken from the costings that we showed at the beginning of this presentation. Your immediate costs are those costs which you're seeing there and then, and that lifetime cost is that potential of £722 per dairy heifer. And as you can see, this is over a 1 year, 1 year of adding a system in. So you've got the cost of your system, which will averagely cost about £1,500. Your running costs, you're looking at £1.79 a day, and so your overall saving in this is about £3,860. But that's just for your first year. So once you've into your second year, as long as nothing's changing, you're then looking at that extra of the £1,500 which you spent on the system.
So some practical tips on how to maintain or ensure that you're on the right path. And the way in which you can do this is carry out regular smoke tests. So if you make any changes to your building design, go back afterwards, do a smoke test again to see how that air is behaving within the building, just to ensure that it is going where you expect it to go and where it should go. Very key point is to, if you have a tube installed, is to clean your fans and your tube. The farming area, the yard area is quite a dusty area, so after a short period of time you're going to get quite a bit of dust build up on your fan grill. You're going to have dust that's going to go through the tube. When that dust goes through the tube, that's in the atmosphere, that means those calves are likely to breathe it in. So once every 3 to 6 months, look to stick a brush or a low pressure hose pipe or such like across the fan and down the tube. Now you can remove the tube completely, or if you've got holes that are at the bottom at 6 o'clock, then that will allow the water to drain out. It's a really, really key thing to make sure that you keep your fan and your tube clean. It's just to make sure that that air that those calves are breathing in is still clean for them. You need to monitor your calf behaviour all year round. Now, yes, you will see peaks and troughs throughout the year of disease, but it's really good you're doing it with other things as well. It's just to monitor how they're behaving. Again, it's like the photograph I showed earlier. The customer there took the boarding off for the summer, but it then created an issue during the winter. So it's just an idea, just to keep an eye on what your calves are doing, how they're behaving all year round, just to make sure you haven't done anything that's going to hamper them. Again, look at the temperature, humidity in the building, especially within summertime. If it's particularly warm, you might find that actually you might need to make some changes which you weren't expecting because it's particularly hot in your building, or maybe it's the opposite. During the winter, it could be quite cold. Again, it's just to monitor that and keep an eye on it. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is to look at the data. If you're going to make a change, get the data for the last 12 months previously off the vet, make a change, and then over the coming weeks and months, analyse and see whether that's had any impact at all. What you really don't want to do is make a change to your building in any way and then find 3 months down the line that it's actually had a negative impact. So if you can look at the data, get your vet to look at the data on a regularish basis as much as you can, then that will show that you're on the right lines.
So to summarise that, all of that, look at what we want you to take back to your farms today is assess what is your current situation on farm. How can you improve that? Look at the small changes you can make which could make big improvements. And finally, just because you make one improvement at one stage, that doesn't mean that that's going to improve the whole farm for the next 2 years. So keep on top of that. Look at how you can maintain that. And if you've got any questions, please come and find us or email us, and we can always be of help. Thank you very much.